The Founder of Demonic Cultivation. An English translation by Fan EE33. Read by Luna Minerva. Chapter 20. Sunshine, Part 3. Oh, so there's some kind of man-eating demon stalking around the place, is there? Wei Ying asked. He'd heard similar stories over 1,000 times, and personally exorcised over 100 of these stories' subjects. They inevitably all turned out to be dull, insipid affairs. The quack's voice rose and fell widely as he spoke.
Exactly! People say that inside the mountain forest there's a man-eating fortress with man-eating monsters living inside. Any ordinary person who mistakenly breaks inside is chewed up until there aren't even little fragments of bone left. None of its victims' bodies can be found, no exceptions. Isn't that frightening?
No wonder Jinling had appeared here. Since he hadn't caught the soul-eating maiden on Dafan Mountain, he must have rushed over here to investigate the monsters in Xinglu Ridge.
It's terrifying,
Wei Ying said. But if there aren't even bone fragments remaining and none of the victims' bodies can be found either, how do you know they've been eaten? The quack was momentarily dumbstruck.
Someone saw it, of course.
But didn't you say just now that anyone who wanders inside will be ripped apart until there aren't even bone fragments left of them? No exceptions? Wei Ying spoke, face full of admiration.
Who's the one that got this information out then? They're amazing. They ran into the monsters and still lived to tell the tale.
The quack said,
This is just how the story goes. How should I know?
Wei Ying said. Then, do you know how many people have been eaten at Xinglu Ridge in total?
When were they eaten? How old were they? Male or female? What were their family names? Where did they live?
No, I don't know, the quack replied. Xinghe's walking encyclopedia, huh? Wei Ying said. Enraged, the quack yanked his basket over his back.
The stories never included that information.
Wei Ying giggled.
No. Don't leave. Let me ask you something else.
Xinglu Ridge is inside Xinghe's borders, right? Isn't it Nie clan territory then? If there really are man-eating monsters wandering inside the ridge, why would they ignore them? To his surprise, the quack didn't reply with, I don't know this time, and instead, his expression became colored by disdain. The Nie clan? If they were still the Nie clan from back in the day, of course they wouldn't be ignoring it. If this kind of story had started going around, they would have stormed the wicked creature's location the next day like thunder clouds flying through the sky in a gale. But the chief of the Nie clan these days, isn't he that complete know-nothing? The Qinghe Nie clan's former chief was Qifangzue Nie Mingjue. He had taken up the position before he had even reached the age of majority, after his father had died in a fit of rage caused by the Jishan Wen clan chief, Wen Ruohan. His style of leadership was upright, outspoken, and unyielding, and he, Zhou Jun Lan Xichen, and Lian Fangzun Qing Guangyao were sworn brothers. In the time following the Sunshot campaign, the Nie clan grew powerful and prestigious under his leadership, giving even the Lanlingjin clan a run for its money. However, Nie Mingjue eventually experienced a qi deviation while cultivating and began chasing hallucinations, dying in a bloody burst of violence in front of the public's eyes. The next in line for the title of chief could only have been his younger brother, Nie Huaisang. Why do you say he's a know-nothing? Wei Ying asked.
You don't know the story? The quack replied. Whenever anyone asks this chief Nie anything, either he doesn't know and can't reply, or he does know but is too scared to say anything. If you're impatient with him or try to force an answer out, he'll only shake his head and cry, I don't know, I really don't know. Then he'll beg to be let go. Isn't this exactly what a know-nothing is like?
In the past, Wei Ying and Nie Huaisang had been classmates. So Wei Wuxian could indeed say a few things about the clan chief. Nie Huaisang didn't have a bad heart, nor was he stupid. However, he had no interest in school, and his wits were employed in other endeavors, such as painting fans, catching birds, fishing, and cutting glass. He was unusually lacking in innate cultivation talent, and was thus hopelessly behind other clans' disciples of the same generation. He had formed a core significantly later, and only with great difficulty. When Nie Mingjue was alive, he often became exasperated with his younger brother, like a smith forging iron which refused to become steel. He was extremely strict with the boy's education, but it was like trying to make wet mud stay stuck to a wall. Now that Nie Huaisang didn't have his older brother to help and supervise him and protect him from the wind and the rain, the Qinghe clan went further downhill like water down rapids with every passing day. After Nie Huaisang came of age, especially after he became clan chief, he often found himself dealing with all kinds of unfamiliar situations and landing in all kinds of hot water. He sought help from everywhere, especially from his older brother's two sworn brothers. One day he'd run to Jinlin Terrace and wail about something to Jin Guangyao, and the next he'd be stammering at the cloud recesses. He was perpetually forced to rely on the support of the Jin and Lan chiefs in order to keep himself upright on the clan chief's chair, and even then he succeeded only by the skin of his teeth. Though people couldn't say it outright, nowadays anytime the name Nie Huaisang was mentioned, the same sentiment was written all over everyone's faces: worthless, good for nothing. Upon remembering all the things which happened in the old days, Wei Wuxian couldn't help but sigh. After completing his inquiry about Xinglu Ridge, he decided he was still going to help the quack with his business, so he bought 2 boxes of rouge, stuck them into his robes by his chest, and returned to Lan Wangji's side. The latter still expressed no desire for the return of his purse. Without speaking, both simultaneously turned in the direction the quack had pointed and began walking. Atop Xinglu Ridge was a remarkably large cypress forest, through which a broad, tree-shaded path ran, surrounded by the sound of wind whistling through the canopy. Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji roamed for a long time, but encountered nothing strange. Indeed, they originally had no expectations of encountering anything, and had taken the journey as a precaution. If a local horror story had any truth to it, there would always be specific, concrete details to be found. When Wei Wuxian had investigated the soul-eating heavenly maiden on Dafan Mountain, he had been able to determine exactly where the victims had lived and what their names were. Even Yan's fiancé's childhood nickname hadn't been able to hide from him. On the other hand, if the locals hemmed and hawed even about details like the victims' names, then the story was most likely sensationalist nonsense that was chasing winds and clutching at shadows. Less than an hour later, and after a great deal of hard work, Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji finally ran into something new. Ahead of them, 7 or 8 human figures neared, swaying back and forth as they moved. Their clothes were ragged, they moved incomparably slowly, and their eyes had rolled back into their heads until only the whites were showing. They looked as though they could easily be knocked to the ground by a gust of wind. As it turned out, this group of walking corpses were of the weakest possible type. Not only was this type of walking corpse bullied by other walking corpses, a slightly stronger than average living human could topple a whole row of them with a single kick. If these corpses encountered a slightly faster than average child, that child could put a whole street between them in a blink of an eye. Even if one captured some extremely unlucky person and sucked away a few breaths of their young energy, the victim wouldn't die. These corpses were merely ugly and stinky, not at all threatening. Thus, if a high-level cultivator encountered some while night hunting, it would just ignore the things and leave them to the juniors to deal with. They operated on the same principle as other skilled hunters. Their prey were tigers and leopards, not mice and rats. As soon as Wei Wuxian saw them approach, he knew that disaster was imminent, and so lowered his head and hid behind Lan Wangji. Sure enough, once the walking corpses had hobbled towards the pair and were about 15 to 20 meters away, they took one glance at Wei Wuxian and experienced such a fright they immediately turned around and retreated, their legs and feet at least 2 or 3 times more nimble than when they had come. Wei Wuxian massaged his temples, then turned. His voice sounded terror-stricken.
"Oh, Han Guangjun, you're so fierce. As soon as they laid eyes on you, they became so scared they instantly turned around and ran away."
Lan Wangji had no words of reply. Continuing to laugh, Wei Wuxian pushed him along.
Move, let's climb off this ridge. It doesn't look to me like there's anything else strange going on. The people here sure are good at making up stories. They've turned a few useless walking corpses into man-eating monsters that don't even spit out the bones of their victims. What man-eating fortress? There's no way this isn't just made up. What a pointless trip.
Lan Wangji had to be shoved several times before he took a single step, but Wei Wuxian hadn't even caught up to him when suddenly frantic barking burst forth from somewhere distant in the forest. The color drained rapidly from Wei Wuxian's face, and in the blink of an eye he darted behind Lan Wangji, squatting and huddling up against him, his arms clinging around the man's waist.
"The sound is still far away. Why are you hiding?"
Lan Wangji said.
First, I'll hide, then we'll talk. Where is it? Where is it?
Lan Wangji turned his ear toward the sound and listened for a short while.
"The bark belongs to Jinling's spirit dog."
Upon hearing Jingling's name, Wei Wuxian stood, but another round of barking immediately forced him back down.
"The spirit's dog barking is frenetic. It must have encountered trouble,"
Lan Wangji said. Wei Wuxian whined incessantly, but forced himself up again onto his 2 shaking legs.
Then let's go see."
Lan Wangji didn't budge. Wei Wuxian said,
Han Guangjun, move a bit, won't you? If you don't move, what am I supposed to do?
The man was silent for a moment.
"You release me first."
The pair tugged and pulled and stumbled and lurched, following the barking, but ended up making 2 wide circles around the forest. The spirit dog's cry suddenly sounded closer, then suddenly further away. Wei Wuxian listened to the howling for a very long time, forcing himself to get used to it. One way or another, he managed to stop stuttering.
There's a maze illusion here?
This maze illusion was obviously man-made. Although Wei Wuxian had been going on about how the stories about Qinglu Ridge were all shadows and hot air earlier, things had now gotten kind of interesting. After a quarter of an hour of barking, the black-maned spirit dog's full-throated cries had yet to diminish. Once Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji broke through the illusion and continued following the noise, it wasn't long before the silhouette of an eerie stone fortress appeared before their eyes amidst the trees. The fortress was all built out of ash-gray stone, and its outer walls were covered in green vines and fallen leaves. Each of its buildings was built in a strange, semicircular shape, and together appeared like several gigantic upside-down bowls covering the ground. As it turned out, Qinglu Ridge did have a stone fortress, so the stories were surprisingly more than just hot air from some empty cave. But it was still hard to say whether this was in fact a man-eating fortress, and what they would find inside. Jinling's spirit dog was running in circles around the stone buildings, sometimes quietly panting, other times barking its head off. It was still cowardly, so it retreated a bit when Lan Wangji neared, but it didn't bolt, and instead howled even more loudly at him and Wei Wuxian. It looked at the stone fortress and dug at the ground with its front paws fretfully, sending mud and dirt flying, restless. Hiding behind Lan Wangji's back, Wei Wuxian spoke with a voice full of agony. Why isn't it leaving yet? Where's its owner? Why is its owner gone? From the time the first bark had jarred their ears up till now, they hadn't heard a single peep from Jinling, not even a cry for help. He must have brought the black-maned spirit dog here, and the animal must have broken through the maze illusion, but the living human seemed to have just vanished.
We should take a look inside,
Lan Wangji said. How? There's no door, Wei Wuxian replied. Indeed, there was no door. The ash-gray stones were sealed tightly shut and free of any entrances or windows. The spirit dog began jumping and howling as though it wanted to grab onto a corner of Lan Wangji's robes with its teeth. But too frightened to actually do so, it circled around the man and bit Wei Wuxian's clothes instead, and began dragging the yearling Lao Zu in a different direction. Wei Wuxian's soul nearly fled through his orifices. He threw out his hands towards Lan Wangji. Lanzhan! 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 The spirit dog dragged Wei Wuxian, and Wei Wuxian dragged Lan Wangji, and thus one dog hauled two people halfway around to the back of the fortress, where, unexpectedly, they saw an opening roughly the height of a human being. Its shape was irregular, and broken rocks covered the ground around it, so someone had obviously used a powerful cultivation tool to blast a hole in the wall. The inside was pitch black, and impossible to see clearly, but there seemed to be a dim red light emanating from somewhere within. The spirit dog loosened its mouth, let go of Wei Wuxian, and barked wildly at the interior. Then it turned towards him and Lan Wangji and wagged its tail frenetically. There was no need to explain. Jinling must have forced his way into the stone fortress and run into something inside. Bichen spontaneously unsheathed itself a few centimeters out of its scabbard. Its edge glowed with a halo of icy, pale blue light, penetrating the darkness and illuminating the path ahead. Lan Wangji bent over at the waist and entered first. That dog was about to drive him mad, so Wei Wuxian rushed in immediately after and almost rammed right into his friend. Holding his hand in support, Lan Wangji shook his head. It was unclear whether the gesture was meant as a criticism or was merely a sign of resignation. Looking very much as though it wanted to follow them inside, the spirit dog ran after them with all its might, but was stopped in its tracks by some unknown force. No matter how hard it tried, it couldn't break through the barrier, leaving it with no option but to sit at the entrance and wag its tail more and more frantically. Wei Wuxian was so delighted, he almost began kneeling in gratitude, but he withdrew his hand and walked a few steps further in. Surrounded by the darkness, the cold blue sword light turned a chilly white. Tall trees and thick forest covered Xinglu Ridge with cool shade, but the inside of the stone fortress was even colder. Wei Wuxian wore simple light robes, and his sleeves and collar were loose, allowing bleak wind to blow in. Plus, the spirit dog had scared a thin layer of cold sweat over his entire body. Like the flame of an extinguished candle, light at the entrance had long disappeared. The further inside Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji walked, the darker and more expansive the space grew. The roof of the stone fortress was dome-shaped, and when Wei Wuxian kicked some loose rocks, he could hear a faint echo. Finally, his endurance met its limit. Halting, he lifted his right hand and pressed against his temple, frowning slightly. Lan Wangji turned back around.
What are you doing?
It's so noisy, Wei Wuxian said. The inside of the fortress was as silent and still as the grave. In fact, it seemed exactly like a grave. But at this moment, to Wei Wuxian's ears, they were surrounded by a raucous din.